Well, thank you for being here as the last speaker and the last plenary speaker. Someone told me this is a tough spot because I come after the wonderful event that happened last night. But I think it's the best spot because you're here. And you're here because you want to be here. And that means you're on the right side of the equation that we're going to be talking about today. So, but thank you for the wonderful event last night, for this wonderful meeting, for the chance to participate in the scientific committee email. I appreciate that, and for the invitation to speak today. I want to give credit to the idea of this from several friends, Rick Pugmire, Rich Kavanaugh, my former boss at NIST, and Gene Peters. So I had a number of conversations. Are we on the right side of the equation and becoming outcome focused instead of just process driven in what we do? So I have to begin with a NIST disclaimer. These are my views and not those of the U.S. government or the institute where I work. And when I ever identify something, that's not an endorsement. Another way to put this would be, I'm here from the U.S. government. I'm here to help you, right? So that's so according to DNA Ancestry, we're going to have a DNA. I have the chance to chair an investigative genetic genealogy session after this, so I wanted to show you my ancestry connection to Sweden here from DNA Ancestry testing. So you can see, according to Ancestry, I have lots of European ancestry, but there is a 5% Swedish. But if you look at the footnote there, there's only 0 to 10% chance, right, that I have some Swedish ancestry. And so with my genealogy, actually, I have more than 6 generations fully completed in my genealogy, and there's no one in that direct line from Sweden. But I do have, you'll see 5% from Ireland as well. So I had the privilege of having Sheila Willis, after she retired, come and work in our laboratory. And so she took me to my family castle, the Butler family castle in Kilkenny, Ireland, just as remnants of my 5% Irish ancestry. That was purchased by my 16th great-grandfather, James Butler, and my distant cousins lived here until 1935. My ancestry came to the United States about 300 years ago. But there's also the Butler chocolates, the purveyors of happiness. So hopefully I can purvey some happiness to you today. But whenever Sheila would come back, she'd bring back some of my cousins' chocolate, and I always appreciated that. When I went to visit the castle, I said they turned it over to the city to avoid paying taxes, I guess. And so I asked if I could get my castle back when I went to visit there. And they said, are you willing to pay the millions of pounds of back taxes? I said, no, you can keep your castle. So I'm from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was formed originally in 1901 with roots back to the U.S. Constitution as the National Bureau of Standards. Originally, the name was changed in 1988 to the National Institute of Standards and Technology to emphasize the work in computers that we do. Our primary campus is just outside of Washington, D.C. in Gaithersburg, Maryland, where I live, and we're part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. We have more than 6,000 employees and associates, and we love to collaborate with people, so we'd love to have you come and work with us on projects. We have reference materials. We also define the official time for the United States, which means I'm supposed to stay on time with this talk, right? But we're a science agency. We're non-regulatory, and that enables us to be able to collaborate and to assemble groups and discuss things. And so our efforts in forensic science are focused in the Special Programs Office, and we have 3 focuses: research, standards, and foundations. And roughly funded in the relative amounts as illustrated here. We have focus areas, 8 focus areas where our research, DNA is what I originally started in forensic genetics. Now we have much wider efforts in digital investigations and drugs and toxins and firearms and so on. We also have the OSAC, the Organization of Scientific Area Committees for Forensic Science, and we're trying to develop standards and working with many of you are part of that organization. We appreciate all of your efforts in collaborating there. And then finally, I'll talk briefly about the foundation studies that we're doing, and that's what I'm leading that effort right now. So we also have a partnership with universities. This is the CSAFE. You may have heard of them, forensic statisticians that are doing research as well in this area, and we fund that effort and have been for a number of years now. But the focus, really, our goal is around quality measurements. We're the National Metrology Institute for the United States, so we're focused on quality measurements in everything that we do. We also have a connection to the Nobel Prize, and since we're here in Stockholm, I thought I'd mention that. We have 5 Nobel Prize winners in physics and in chemistry that worked at NIST. And Wilmer Sauter, the very first person to work on forensic science that was brought up earlier, is there ever going to be a Nobel Prize in forensic science? Well, I'd say the closest would probably be Wilmer Sauter. He received his PhD in 1916, but he worked at NIST first as a technician and then came back after he got his PhD to work until 1954 on forensic science. And I'll tell you a little bit about him in a moment. But he worked under two Nobel laureates, Albert Michelson, who received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1907, and Robert Millikan, who received the Nobel Prize in 1923. Well, what did Wilmer Sauter do his PhD on? The photoelectric effect, which is what his boss got the Nobel Prize for a couple years later in 1923. So there is a connection there between the Nobel Prize and the forensic science, loosely, back in the early 1900s. So Wilmer Sauter, the first forensic scientist at NIST, this is him pictured in his laboratory in 1935, right after he had testified in the biggest trial that had happened in the United States at the time, which is this kidnapping of the Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh's baby had been kidnapped, and he testified in that trial as a handwriting expert. And you can see the gun cabinet that he has there, and also the little bullets that he had to illustrate the lands and grooves and the ballistic measurements that he was making. He was called Washington's Detective X. There was an article that was written in 1954 in Reader's, or 1951 in Reader's Digest on that. And we've kind of rediscovered him, if you will, and some articles are on that. There's actually a YouTube video that we made that you can watch about him. But one of the most interesting things, after he concluded his career, he wrote an article in the journal Science about effective testimony for scientific witnesses. If you go back and read that article, if anyone would like a copy, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to send it to you. But he talks about, I'll just hear the first sentence there. The research scientist is trained by instructors who are experts in a selected field of specialization. And he talks about the importance of reading and preparing and being the audience of how you testify in court. And so he had a lot of experience. He worked more than 800 cases in firearms and in handwriting. Now, NIST doesn't do casework anymore. We're focused on research, but that was something that was done in the early 1900s. So there's a lot we can learn as we look to the past that can help us prepare for the future, which is what I want to focus on today as we move to how do we get to the right side of the equation. So how do we measure success? As we talk about the things we've discussed today and throughout this week at this conference, I want to think about what are we doing to try to measure success, or how do we do that? Well, there's a number of wonderful things you can learn by studying. This is one of my favorite books, How Will You Measure Your Life? Written by Clayton Christensen, a professor at Harvard Business School. And he takes a lot of business models and talks about how you can improve your life and how you can measure the successfulness of your life. And I want to take some of those things and apply those today to forensic science and to some of the things we can do to measure success as we think about where we are and where we need to go in our individual efforts. So what's the equation that I'm talking? I keep bringing up the equation, being on the right side of the equation. The equation I'm talking about here is we start with components to something, we have a process or a set of processes, and then we have an outcome. And if you think about components, that might be technology that's involved, it might be people that are a part of components to getting something done, the latest instruments, might be chemical reagents that you have, the laboratory environment that you've established. The process might be involved with the culture or the management, the standard operating procedures. The culture of an entire community can be a part of a process. Training and experience being part of, like coming to a meeting like this. But what's the outcome then? That would be the research results. It could be the casework reports. It could be the courtroom testimony that's being given. It could be a rewarding career if you look at this overall. So as we talk about this equation, we want to be on the right side of the equation. In other words, focused on what's the outcome, what are we becoming, and not just what we're doing. So often we think about the components as the what or the how, is the process, when it be the how something's done. But what really matters is so what and how well. So just because you're doing something, is you just doing it because that's the way it's always been done, or are you doing it because you want to improve and you want to show how well something's being done? That's what we want to talk about today, is how do we get to that right side of the equation of looking to the outcome. So are we on the right side of the equation? On the left side of the equation is something where you're very process-driven. You're very focused on getting stuff done. And it's very important to do this well, but if we want to move to the outside, to the right side, we want to be focused on the performance and how something is being done. So yesterday, Justice talked about cake, so I added this in here. And you think about the cake example, you have to have good ingredients, you have to have the right process, the right temperature that you cook it at, but what really matters is how does that cake taste? That's how you're evaluating it, not the fact that you can set the oven up to be able to cook at a certain temperature, or you can mix the sugar and flour and the different components and get those the same every time. What matters is the outcome, the performance, and that's what we're talking about, is getting that right cake on the right side of the equation. So to do this, we have to think systems thinking and looking at the big picture for how we want to get this done. We want to think about how inputs impact the outputs for the work that we're doing. We want to talk about going from just doing something to what are we becoming, and the focus on being something. Now, there's a lot that's being done in the general literature. You'll see this is an article that just came out about 3 weeks ago in The Atlantic, which talks about, it's called Did James Parsons Kill His Wife? But it has a lot of focus on forensic science. And there's a paragraph in here that I pulled out, and it cites the forensic focus, what I would call being on the left side of the equation. When asked to explain why forensics goes wrong, critics cite 3 factors. First, some commonly used forensic methods have not been rigorously evaluated. Second, the overwhelmingly majority of crime laboratories are not independent. They're underneath police, that's what's talked about later. And then finally, the third is that no one from the outside is rigorously checking the work done by forensic analysts. Accreditation largely focuses on having the right procedure spelled out on paper, and proficiency tests given to laboratory analysts are extremely easy. The quality of work done in crime labs is almost never audited. Now, you may not agree with all the things that are here, but this is what's being said in this article that was published 3 weeks ago. It has a very wide audience, the general public. This is the message that's being sent. So what do we do about that? As a forensic community, how do we counter this? How do we get to the right side of the equation instead of what they're focusing on the left side of the equation, the process or the components, instead of how do we get to the better outcome? Now, at the beginning of the week, Melissa Taylor from NIST talked about the dirty dozen in her keynote at the Forensic Management. And she talked about some most common preconditions for human error. Like, for example, poor communication could be something that would affect that. Or loss of awareness can affect things. Or lack of teamwork. And that's really what was being emphasized in this conference. We went together for a safer world. We want to be working together on things, and that will help overcome and move us to the right side of the equation. So what I want to focus on today in my talk is moving from, she talked about dirty dozen, is to give you 5 Bs to strengthen forensic science from the right side of the equation. So we want to be versatile. What does it mean here? We want to widen our awareness to more than one area. So if we're just focused on one thing, we'll talk about it in a minute, then sometimes we forget how these other pieces fit together, the bigger picture. We want to be communicative. Now, Neve talked about this earlier in the week. Justice talked about this yesterday. But we need to be clear in communicating with all stakeholders. Yes, I use the word stakeholders. I'll talk about that in a moment, Jill. We want to be transparent as well. And a number have talked about this. We need to be honest with what we know and what we don't know. And there are things we don't know, and we need to be honest with those limitations. We need to be reflective and review the past so we can learn from it. And finally, we need to be kind because we are part of a community. So these are the 5 Bs: versatile, communicative, transparent, reflective, and kind. I'm going to go through each of those individually, talk about them. Why does this matter? Because in the end, you think about a beehive is an image of industry or hard work. And it's that collaboration, that community collaboration, which makes wonderful honey that we enjoy. So are we busy bees? Are we working on these things to help us come together to be able to make a difference here? So let's begin with being versatile. And this, what I'm talking about here is widening awareness to more than one area. Now, Nicholas Butler, who is the president of Columbia University, not a direct relative to me, distant cousin again, probably one of the chocolate people, you know. But he says an expert is one who knows more and more about less and less until he knows absolutely everything about nothing. And unfortunately, I see that all the time. I actually quoted this in one of my books because I felt like that's something that is important to keep in mind, that if we're so focused on something, We learn it very, very well, but then we miss the bigger picture of what's happening. We get so focused on the left side of the equation that we miss out on learning where we're going, the right side of the equation. But Nicholas Butler also said the following: the one serious conviction that a man should have is that nothing is to be taken too seriously. So he had some great quotes. But I love this fact that we think about experts. We need to have expertise, but we also need to have awareness beyond that. So my early scientific career benefited from straddling two disciplines. So I got my degree in analytical chemistry, but I also had to know molecular biology to do DNA research. And so my first two, I use this to illustrate, my first two presentations were given to two completely different audiences. And that, I didn't realize at the time, but I learned a lot from that experience. Even though the titles of those talks were the same, the talks were very different. And the questions I received were very different. The first talk was at the Frederick Conference on Capillary Electrophoresis, and I was talking about the details of how DNA separations work and the chemistry of all of that. The second talk at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences was very focused on how do you apply this, what's the meaning of this in terms of the DNA results, and they didn't focus so much on the details of the chemistry. But having to know both of those and having a wider awareness than just only knowing the capillary electrophoresis enabled me to be able to develop my scientific career and make me more of a well-rounded scientist so I could appreciate and understand the bigger picture of why these things were important. And that's something to keep in mind. If we focus so much on one thing, like Nicholas Butler mentioned, we know more and more about less and less until we know everything about nothing. And you had to do that for school, but when you come into the career, you need to be able to have a more expansive understanding. So the other thing is I made a career shift a few years ago. I had worked in the applied genetics group, leading the DNA efforts at NIST for a number of years, first as a research chemist and then as a group leader. And that's where I did the forensic DNA research that most people know me for, first as a postdoc and then as the project leader and group leader, where I authored the 5 textbooks that were mentioned on forensic DNA. But in 2013, I felt like I've learned the things I need to learn there. I need to move to the right side of the equation to understand the bigger picture here. So I became a special assistant to the director for forensic science, moved to the special programs office at NIST, and also had the chance to be the vice chair of the National Commission on Forensic Science. And that was a wonderful opportunity to see a very broad picture of what was happening in the forensic science field and how we could help try to strengthen that. And after the commission closed in 2017, I've had the chance to work on scientific foundation reviews, and I'll explain those in a moment. First on DNA mixture interpretation, on digital evidence, working on bite marks, and on firearms to try to understand where we are and where we need to go in these areas. But one of the blessings has been working with multidisciplinary teams to see the issues from the different lenses. Working with like Melissa Taylor, who has a human factors and social science background, and Sheila Willis came and worked with us on our first one. And the experience she brought in forensic science was wonderful. But to have then molecular biologists, to have chemists, to have statisticians, all these different perspectives has really given us different views into what's happening. And I've also had the opportunity to help set up the OSAC and to serve on the Academy Standards Board, working on further standards, and to really help oversee a lot of the research activities happening at NIST in all the various disciplines. That has been a wonderful blessing to me, and I know the same kind of thing can happen as we move from sometimes being lab-based to office-based, and a broader perspective has been helpful for being able to see the bigger picture. So there's lots of benefits in having a meeting like this where you have lots of disciplines here, and that brings benefits of learning from presentations outside of your area, and you can take those lessons and apply those and move to the right side of the equation. And when you become solution-oriented with a very broad perspective, that gives you the chance to learn from one area and apply it to another. So we've had a chance to look at different areas in this particular meeting. But one of the goals of OSAC is to have, that's the reason we have an organization that's all together, so that we have the ability to have that crosstalk and to learn from one another and to strengthen not just one discipline, but to work across those. That hasn't worked as well as we'd like to. We can still improve there, but that's one of the goals. At NIST, we've also had the opportunity to work on a number of conferences. Since 2012, we've been helping try to assist the community moving to the right side of the equation. These are the meetings, and we'll put this presentation up on our website so you can download it. But when you click on these links, they'll take you to each of these things. You can learn about the work we've done on handwriting or on firearms, on synthetic drugs, and so on. But what I have in yellow there is we have a Forensics at NIST conference that's held every 2 years. It kind of gives you an overview of all the different things that NIST is doing. And we have those videos and stuff are still available for people to watch. So we hope that this can help that you and anyone in the community that wants to learn, and the members of the general public as well, to move to the right side of the equation that way. Okay, second, I want to talk about being communicative. We need to be clear in communicating with all of our stakeholders, both internal and external. Now, this is what Jill, I think, was thinking about the other day when she talks about stakeholders and not liking that. She told me this yesterday, so I put this picture in of someone holding a stake. That's why she talks about it in terms of customers. But the bottom line is we need to be good communicators. The word forensic itself is connected to the Roman forum. And that was a place where discussion happened, where we had an opportunity to interact with and learn from. So complex topics need to be communicated clearly, and that's a very big challenge, but it can be done with everyone. And I believe that. I've tried to do that throughout my career, not only to members of the immediate community you may be working with, but also to the wider community, the general public. Effective communication is needed in both written form and in oral, in communication and speaking. This is why I did the workshop yesterday, and it was really a neat experience to be able to teach this, because how do we improve our scientific publication? Because we had people from digital, we had fire investigators there, we had DNA, we had fingerprints, all the different disciplines were represented because this applies to everything. Communication is moving to the right side of the equation there is something that is for everyone, not just one particular discipline. So it was mentioned that I've written 5 textbooks, but writing for practitioners is very different than writing for the general public. And so I've had a chance to write these books and think very deeply about the subject and learn it very well. I've just finished another book that's written for the general public. And this is coming out from Cambridge University Press later this year in the Understanding Life series. So there's one on understanding forensic DNA now. There's one on understanding DNA ancestry, one on understanding evolution, or ecology, or COVID. There's all kinds of books that are coming out on this topic. I hope this is in every bookstore that can be accessible to everyone. So it's 198 pages, written in very simple and clear language to discuss to the general public. These are the things that are where the challenges and limitations exist. For example, chapter 6 is called The Curse of Sensitivity, because there's a blessing and a curse to getting more sensitive in techniques that you're doing. So we hope that this type of thing will be able to reach and influence people. One of my favorite papers I've read in the last couple of years is this one, called 5 Rules for Evidence Communication, that David Spiegelhalter gave. His group wrote, and it's published in the journal Nature. And he talks about the importance of informing, not trying to persuade as a scientist, offering balance, not false balance, disclosing uncertainties, stating evidence quality, and inoculating against misinformation. He uses COVID information to be able to talk about this, but as I read this article, I thought this applies perfectly to forensic science, and to think about how we communicate things, and what are we doing to try to strengthen the field, and again, to try to move to that right side of the equation there. There's wonderful resources that already exist, and I wanted to point a couple of them out. The Making Sense About Science, and specifically this one on forensic genetics, was done as part of the Euro4Gen project that Peter Snyder and others have led. And this is a free PDF file you can get, but the final point that they make that I think is a really important one. As DNA profiling continues to grow more sensitive, and it is used in more investigations, the need for accurate communication between scientists and non-scientists only grows, both to ensure that the expectations of the technology are realistic and that its limits are properly understood. That is a key issue. There's limits to any method, and so what are those what are the limitations? Understanding that. This has been translated into Spanish and Portuguese and Polish through the efforts of the International Society for Forensic Genetics. And if there's other languages you'd like to have this in, let us know. I serve as the president of ISFG right now, and we'd like to get this out to as many people as possible to make this in a form that's useful for your country and for your groups. On the other side, thinking about communication, you have to talk in narratives often. This is a new book that just came out from Chris Fabricant from the Innocence Project, and it's called Junk Science and the American Criminal Justice System. It's written with very compelling narrative. It's written to reach the general public. He's on a national book tour right now. He actually came to my hometown. This is a picture I took of him 2 weeks ago when I went to see him at the Gaithersburg Book Festival that he came and spoke at. This is a big book festival that people come from all over to speak at, but he came and spoke there. And he's being interviewed here by a former prosecutor who's also an author now. And he discusses bite mark analysis, hair microscopy, and fire investigations. But then he also talks about the importance of having valid forensic science. If that's not done, that's what he lumps into junk science. Now, you may not like the messages being conveyed in some of these, but he's doing an excellent job of reaching the general public. The people that were there were very engaged because of the narrative and how he told the story. And so that same kind of thing needs to happen if we're going to then improve the perceptions and the impact of forensic science. Neve mentioned the Scientific American, which started in 1845, is reaching the general public. This is an article just published last week. The field of firearms forensics is flawed. That was published in Scientific American. And it has a very compelling narrative as well that's describing. And so we say, are we on the right side of the equation with how things are being communicated with people? This is reaching a very wide audience. Like I said, it has a very compelling narrative. The paper that would go with this on the forensic science side is one that's published in FSI Synergy that's written by the FBI, because this is what's being talked about in that thing. But they talk about the design of this particular study that's mentioned, but it's more complex to talk about. It's detailed tables and stuff. But there's nothing on the right side of the equation, if you will, to be able to describe what's the outcome of this in a way that's accessible to the general public. So that's what's needed if you're going to be able to counter the efforts that are going on the other side as part of this. Now, Neve McDade has done a wonderful job putting together these with Sue Black and others, the Judiciary Court, Royal Society primers for the court. And there's 6 of those now that are available. And I had the privilege of working with Jill Tully on the first one, to putting that out. That came out in 2017, 60 pages long, giving a nice explanation of DNA. And I think that this type of thing is wonderful to get the ball rolling and started. But it may be too much for some people even. And so at NIST, we've been thinking about how do we help the officers of the court. In the United States, they don't have the attention span sometimes to even read 60 pages. And so we have 2 pages that we're working on that summarize specific issues that we're trying to develop. Right now we have 18 of these in development that are cross-cutting. So this is one on just explaining what is accreditation, what is certification. And some of the features here are that we're looking at just very brief explanations. We're trying to make comparisons. In this case, we're looking at comparing accreditation and certification. We're discussing the limitations that exist with this type of method. We provide some specific examples from forensic science. We then have links, hyperlinks you can see in the lower right-hand corner that would go to more information, and there's key takeaways that someone can take from this. We don't know how well these will work. We've given them out to a few judges so far to get their kind of measure how well they understand this, but this is something that we want to develop more of because we feel it's important that that information be communicated so that we can help people get to the outcome that matters here. When we worked on the first foundation review on DNA mixture interpretation, we felt it was very important to explain, why does this matter? DNA works, right? But the DNA mixtures are a different ballgame entirely in terms of some of the challenges there. And so this was written for the general public and made available now 3 years ago and as a general explainer. And if you do a Google search now for DNA mixtures, this is the #1 hit. And that's nice to be able to get that information out there to explain what are the basics of why are people trying to do probabilistic genotyping. And using nice illustrations, you can see the vegetable soup there, the John Q. suspect that's used as the spoon lifts out, and we illustrate that with a couple things. But we have a role as a scientists, if we want to communicate better. This is a National Academy of Sciences report a couple years ago, Communicating a Science Effectively, and it mentions that communicating science effectively is a complex task and an acquired skill. that skill can be developed and can be used to help move things forward. Many believe the forensic community has a duty to engage society to disseminate this knowledge. Any communication involves a communicator, an audience, and channels of communication. So think about, what are your channels of communication so that you can reach the general audience you need to be able to touch and influence. And then a scientific community has an obligation to communicate the results of its work to the rest of society. You know, the funding for laboratories in forensic science comes from the public, and that needs to be then the public deserves to know more about what's happening. So if we want to be on the right side of the equation here, we need to be better at communicating. And some are doing a fantastic job, but there's always room for improvement there. Next, to be transparent, to be honest with what we know and what we don't know. So there's been many calls for what data exists behind forensic methods and practices from the National Academy of Sciences report in 2009, the National Commission on Forensic Science, the PCAST report, and they talk specifically about we need to demonstrate the validity of methods. We need to have technical merit evaluation, or need to establish foundational validity. What we've called these at NIST is the NIST Scientific Foundation Reviews. And so we've been doing these the last couple years, and we received congressional funding that uses the language from the National Commission on Forensic Science. But our goal here is to be able to show reliability. And so obtaining reliability or the trustworthiness to be consistently accurate, that's an important goal in all of forensic science. We've heard that throughout this meeting. So NIST, as part of this ecosystem, is trying to do this as well. So we're trying to focus on what are the key principles, just like we heard from the Cindy Declaration, the key principles that are being identified there. We're trying to identify those in each discipline and each method that's set. We're trying to then look at all the available literature and information that's accessible there and have confidence. Can people have confidence in the results? If they can't, what are some of the things we can do to improve there? And that's what we're really focusing on with these reports. So currently we have 4 projects underway. The first one, DNA mixture interpretation, a 250-page draft report was released last June. And we did a webinar after that, and we received about 500 pages of public comments. We're going through all of those, and we'll release later this year a final version. We're doing bite mark analysis, digital evidence, which was just released as a draft report a couple weeks ago. And we had a webinar 2 days ago on June 1st. And then we're doing firearms examination as well. Each of these is being provided with a 60-day public comment period is the plan as we go forward with these. And right now, the digital evidence one is available. So I invite you to read that to then make comments if you have any. This is the front page of that, 84 pages long. It breaks down into 12 key takeaways, and we're seeking public comment through July 11th. And so we invite you to read and comment, even if you're not directly involved in digital forensic stuff, because that you might be able to provide something that's valuable to improve it. So are we on the right side of the equation? We want to know that too in what we're doing with these reports. We also did, as part of this work, we did the first black box, or the first interlaboratory study with digital forensic investigators. This was open to anyone in the public. About a third of the people that participated were international, about 2/3 of the United States. But there's anyone, public or private, that could participate. We released this back in February. We had 24 questions that used case scenarios and test artifacts for both mobile devices and for computer hard drives that were developed in collaboration with colleagues in the U.S. Secret Service and National White Collar Crime Center. The study participants, we ended up with 77 mobile device and 102 hard drive analyses. And so we collected basic information like the workplace environment, the education, the work experience. We estimate from what we've done in the foundation review that there's more than 11,000 digital forensic units in the United States and internationally. So that you see, we only got a very, very small percentage of that. And what we found is people were unwilling to talk, or their agencies wouldn't allow them to participate in this without all kinds of special permissions and things like that. And so that's one of the things we've observed is it's hard to have interlaboratory studies sometimes because people are scared to participate in them. But there's a lot of benefit in having the ability to look across and understand where are we as a community? Are we on the right side of the equation there? So this has been on my mind a lot with validation studies. We think about there's a claim as validation studies are done is that there's a checklist of criteria has been made. Often you'll see that's very process driven. I did these studies that are shown there. This came to me mind recently because I was asked a couple weeks ago to review a validation plan for a laboratory, and as I noticed that they didn't care about what the outcome was. It's just, is it okay if I run 5 samples of this or this? And that's all they cared about. And so instead of they were looking at the left side of the equation, instead of being focused on how does the performance look, and verifying the performance, an examination of how well things worked. And one of the things I was talking to Karina Benshop yesterday from NFI, and I really thought what she's trying to do with looking at performance is excellent. Trying to figure out where are things working in their laboratory. And that's where we want to be moving to looking at performance, and not just looking at did I do a bunch of tasks, did I do the process here. Just media coverage on this particular issue. A couple years ago, the Austin Police Department closed down their DNA laboratory. They talk about untrained staff, improper training procedures that raised concerns. They were using outdated methods to interpret test results. So as you think about accreditation here, their laboratory was shut down in 2016, but they had passed 17 audits over the previous 13 years, okay? And these audits, when this concern was raised to the Texas Forensic Science Commission, one of the representatives of the accrediting body was there, and they said, there's no consensus on what is acceptable in the DNA community, and we, ANAB, do not establish the scientific foundation. We assess to that. We expect the technical community to be establishing what scientifically needs to be done. This is just a summary from the Texas Forensic Science Commission. 2/3 of the audits to the Austin Police Department had 0 findings in their audit. And yet when you actually looked at what their methods were, once they were opened up and you could see their methods, they were not doing something that was scientifically valid. And that's why their laboratories closed down. Literally millions of dollars have been spent looking at this issue. There's a nice report that was published about almost 2 years ago now, a 158-page report. 57 contributing factors and conditions that influence that, and 87 recommendations for a new DNA laboratory. Now, why does this matter to you? You're not the Austin Police Department, so you may not care, but there are wonderful recommendations in there that you can learn from that can help you be on the right side of the equation in your own work, and so I invite you to look at that. Running out of time here, but we need to be reflective and look at where we've come from. Wilmer Sauter, I mentioned, earlier, he gave a talk called Beware the Amateur Expert in 1933. Many workers are operating without the least supervision or concern as to what is the correct scientific procedure. He mentions as well, success comes from skill in selecting the proper method and following through to its correct application, in other words, getting to the right side of the equation. Another statement also given to the International Chiefs of Police in 1936, the use of a basis of evidence of instruments whose validity is not known will merely discredit investigation work. This individual pleads for greater knowledge of validity of scientific methods and the development of more valid measures, and he proposes a National Bureau of Standards in criminology, largely because of Sauter's work. He says, we must be certain of the limitations as well as the merits of any technique that's being used. I find it very interesting that 73 years later, the National Academy of Sciences comes out and proposes a National Institute of Forensic Science, basically the exact same concepts. And so if you look at also things that Sauter wrote about firearms identification, he said we need to have standards for equipment, standards for records of evidence, standards for qualification of experts that include the actual tests that are being done, the methods for constantly following up with experts testifying. I would say that 90 years later, we're still dealing with the exact same challenges, that they haven't been fully addressed because many haven't moved to the right side of the equation then. OSAC is trying to work on some of these things. We have efforts because of ISO accreditation. We have PCAST requesting, and we have empirical data that support the conclusions being made. And we have the Department of Justice now monitoring the FBI examiner testimony. So there are starts of things that are happening here, but I ask, are we learning from history or are we still repeating it? So finally, just let's be kind as we're part of a community. The National Commission on Forensic Science, having the opportunity to work with this group was a fantastic experience, and learning from so many different perspectives that were brought to the table. We had lab directors, we had judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, many professors, and we had sheriffs and detectives and coroners and medical examiners, victims advocates and defense advocates. That closed a couple years ago after 2 terms of service there, but there was 43 work products that came out of that after the 13 meetings. Those are available on the archives, and there's a wonderful document kind of reflecting back and looking to the future. We maintain, NIST maintains all the digital recordings of these commission meetings, so if you ever want to learn more about some of the things that were discussed there, and there's wonderful things to learn from. Let me just close with saying that if we want to go fast, go alone. If we want to go far, we go together. And that's kind of the theme of this conference, Together for a Safer World. Collaboration leads to being on the right side of the equation as we focus on outcomes. So with that, I'll just conclude with saying there's things we can do to be stronger in strengthening forensic science from the right side of the equation. Be versatile, be communicative, be transparent, be reflective, and be kind, so that we can become better busy bees, if you will, to help make the right things for the community. So thank you very much for your attention. Happy to take questions now, or feel free to email me. Thanks.